The faint hum of crickets filled the quiet night air, broken only by the occasional creak of a floorboard inside the modest suburban house. Edward sat on the edge of his worn armchair, his trembling hands clutching a blanket. His mind, clouded by Alzheimer's, struggled to piece together the puzzle of his surroundings. A distant sound brought his focus back, a faint tapping, followed by a low creak near the front door. Edward squinted, his blurry eyes locking onto the dark silhouette outside the frosted glass. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice shaky but laced with curiosity. Slowly he shuffled toward the door, his slippers dragging against the wooden floor. As he reached the door, another knock echoed softly, hesitant but deliberate. Edward hesitated, gripping the doorknob. "Who is it?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. Behind him, a low growl cut through the stillness. Edward turned to see Max, the pitbull he'd taken in just days ago, standing alert near his feet. Max's muscular frame was tense, his ears pinned back and his gaze fixed on the door. "It's okay, boy," Edward murmured, though his own heart raced. Maybe it's a friend. But as the doorknob rattled slightly, Max let out a deep guttural bark, one that sent chills through the room. The shadow outside shifted, and Edward heard muffled voices, hurried and agitated. "Just get inside already," one voice hissed. The sound of glass shattering ripped through the night as one of the windows near the door splintered into jagged shards. Edward gasped, stepping back in confusion. His hands trembled as he clutched the blanket tighter, unsure of what was happening. Before he could process the chaos, Max lunged toward the broken window, barking ferociously. His snarls echoed through the house, a primal warning to whoever dared come closer. Edward stumbled backward, his knees buckling as the intruders forced their way into the dimly lit living room. Two men stepped forward, their faces partially obscured by masks. "Stay quiet, old man, and no one gets hurt," one of them growled, his hand tightening around a crowbar. But Max didn't back down. The dog stood his ground, his teeth bared and his growls growing louder. The first man hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the pitbull's aggression. "Where did this dog come from?" he muttered to his partner. "Doesn't matter," the second man snapped, stepping closer to Edward. "Keep it distracted." Edward's confusion deepened as he looked at the two men, struggling to recognize them. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice wavering. "Are you friends of Michael?" The men exchanged a glance, their frustration growing. "He's out of it," one of them muttered. As the second man moved toward Edward, Max leaped forward, snapping at his arm. The man yelped, stumbling back as Max's jaws narrowly missed him. "Get that dog under control," the first man shouted, swinging the crowbar in Max's direction. But Max was relentless. He barked and lunged again, his sheer determination forcing the men to retreat further toward the broken window. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made the intruders freeze. Headlights washed over the living room, and they exchanged panicked looks. "Let's get out of here," one of them barked. They scrambled back toward the window, clambering over the shards of glass as Max chased them out, his barks echoing into the night. The front door swung open, and Michael rushed in, his face pale with worry. "Dad? Dad? Are you okay?" Edward sat on the floor, his breathing ragged and his eyes wide with confusion. "Michael," he murmured, his voice trembling. I think we had visitors." Michael's eyes darted to the broken window, then to Max, who stood panting but triumphant near the door. "What happened?" he demanded, kneeling beside his father. Before Edward could respond, Max padded over, nudging Edward's hand gently with his nose. The gesture brought a faint smile to Edward's face, and he reached out to stroke the dog's fur. He protected me," Edward said softly, his voice filled with awe. "This dog, Max, he saved me." Michael stared at Max, his mind racing as he pieced together what must have happened. He looked at the broken glass, the faint drops of blood where Max had likely bitten one of the intruders, and then back at his father. "Good boy," Michael whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out to pat Max's head, and for the first time, the dog allowed it, his tail wagging faintly. The distant sound of sirens grew louder as neighbors, alerted by the commotion, began to gather outside. Michael pulled out his phone, quickly dialing the police to report the break-in. As the chaos settled and the sirens drew closer, Edward sat back in his chair, his hands still resting on Max. The dog leaned against him, his steady presence grounding Edward in a way Michael hadn't seen in years. "I told you," Edward murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching sirens. "I told you he's special." Max looked up at Edward, his brown eyes filled with quiet understanding. The chapter ends with Michael watching the scene, a new sense of respect and gratitude blooming in his chest. He couldn't deny it. Max had proven himself to be more than just a stray. He was a protector. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the small living room, casting warm light on the framed photos lining the mantel. Pictures of Edward as a younger man, smiling with his late wife, holding Michael as a baby, painted a story of a life once full of clarity and purpose. Now those moments were fragments, scattered like leaves in Edward's foggy mind. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. He hadn't slept much since the break-in. The sight of the shattered window and the thought of what could have happened if Max hadn't been there replayed in his mind like a broken record. In the corner of the room, Max lay curled on a blanket, his eyes closed but his ears alert. He had been watching over Edward all night, only dozing off after Michael assured him everything was safe. "Come on, Dad," Michael called gently from the kitchen. "Breakfast is ready." Edward shuffled in from his bedroom, wearing an old cardigan that hung loosely over his frail frame. His eyes scanned the room, lingering on Max, who perked up at the sound of his name. "There's my boy," Edward said, a soft smile breaking across his face. He crouched down with some difficulty to scratch Max behind the ears. "You're always here, aren't you?" Michael watched the interaction from the kitchen, his chest tightening. For weeks, he had struggled to connect with his father. Edward's Alzheimer's had robbed him of so much: his independence, his memories, and at times his ability to recognize Michael. But with Max, there was no hesitation. Edward's days followed a predictable rhythm. He spent most of his time sitting on the front porch, gazing out at the neighborhood and occasionally waving at passers-by. His moments of lucidity came and went, leaving Michael to wonder which version of his father he'd find from one hour to the next. That morning, after breakfast, Edward took his usual spot on the porch with Max at his feet. He hummed an old tune, something Michael vaguely remembered his mother singing years ago, and stroked Max's fur absent-mindedly. "Do you know this song, Max?" Edward asked, his voice light and wistful. "We used to sing it all the time. She had a voice like an angel." Max tilted his head, his brown eyes locked on Edward, as if he understood every word. Michael stood inside the doorway watching them. It was the first time in months he'd seen his father so calm, so present. Max had a way of grounding Edward, pulling him out of the haze of his mind and back into the moment. The peace of the morning was interrupted when Michael's phone buzzed on the counter. He answered it quickly, recognizing the number from his office. "Michael," his boss's voice came through, stern and to the point. "We need you to come in this afternoon. There's an issue with the client files and it can't wait." Michael glanced toward the porch, where Edward was now talking softly to Max. His father seemed stable, but leaving him alone always came with risks. "I can't today," Michael began, his voice tinged with frustration. Michael," his boss interrupted, "this isn't a request. If you can't handle your responsibilities, we'll have to reevaluate your position." Michael sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'll be there," he said reluctantly, ending the call. A short while later, Michael stepped out onto the porch, his keys jangling in his hand. Edward looked up at him with a puzzled expression. "Where are you going?" Edward asked, his brow furrowing. "I have to go to work for a bit," Michael explained. "I won't be gone long. Max will keep you company, okay?" Edward looked down at Max, who wagged his tail as if to confirm the arrangement. "You're leaving me with him?" Edward asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Good. He's better company than most people I know." Michael managed a small smile, though the guilt gnawed at him. "I'll be back soon, Dad. Just stay inside and don't open the door for anyone, okay?" Edward waved him off. Yes, I'll be fine. Don't you worry about me." Michael gave Max one last pat before heading to his car. "Look after him, boy," he said softly. The afternoon passed slowly. Edward moved between the porch and the living room, occasionally talking to Max as if the dog were an old friend. At one point, he opened a dusty photo album and showed Max pictures of his younger self. "That's me," Edward said, pointing to a black and white photo of himself in a military uniform. "Handsome, wasn't I? And this," he turned the page. "This was Sarah, my Sarah, the love of my life." Max rested his head on Edward's knee, his warm presence comforting. "You remind me of someone," Edward continued, his voice growing softer. "There was a dog, years ago. A good dog, loyal, just like you." The conversation was interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps outside. Edward's head snapped up, his expression shifting to one of confusion. "Sarah!" he called out instinctively, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" Max stood, his ears perking up as he moved toward the door. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and Edward followed him, his steps slow and unsteady. He reached the door and peered through the frosted glass, but no one was there. "Huh," he muttered, turning back to Max. "I could have sworn—" Max stayed by the door, his body tense. Edward shook his head, muttering to himself as he shuffled back to his chair. When Michael returned that evening, he found Edward dozing in the living room with Max lying protectively at his feet. The sight made him pause, the stress of the day momentarily melting away. He walked over and placed a hand on Max's head. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're doing a better job than I ever could." Max blinked up at him, his tail wagging faintly. Michael sat down in the chair across from his father, watching as Edward stirred awake. "Oh, Michael," Edward said, his voice groggy. "You're back." "Yeah, Dad," Michael replied. "I'm back." Max shifted closer to Edward, leaning against his leg. The connection between the two was undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Max was exactly what they both needed. The following morning was unusually peaceful. Sunlight poured through the curtains, filling the living room with a warm glow. Edward sat in his usual spot on the couch, absently running his fingers through Max's fur as the dog lay sprawled across the floor. The soft rhythm of Edward's touch seemed to soothe them both, creating a rare moment of calm. Michael watched from the kitchen, sipping his coffee. It had only been a few days since Max had arrived, yet the dog already felt like a permanent fixture in their lives. Michael couldn't deny it. Max was good for Edward. He brought a sense of stability, of companionship, that Michael alone couldn't provide. "Do you want to go outside, boy?" Edward asked, breaking the silence. Max's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, tail wagging enthusiastically. Edward chuckled, his eyes lighting up in a way Michael hadn't seen in months. "All right, let's go," Edward said, pushing himself up from the couch. Outside on the porch, Edward settled into his favorite rocking chair while Max explored the small front yard. He sniffed at the bushes, trotted along the sidewalk, and occasionally glanced back at Edward, as if to make sure he was still there. "You know," Edward began, his voice soft, "I used to have a dog like you. His name was Charlie, a German shepherd. Best dog I ever had." Max paused, looking up at Edward as if he understood. "Charlie went everywhere with me," Edward continued. "When I joined the army, I had to leave him behind. Hardest thing I ever did." He sighed, his gaze distant. "But you remind me of him. Same loyalty, same heart." Michael stepped outside, catching the tail end of the conversation. He leaned against the doorframe, listening quietly as his father spoke. "I'm glad you're here, Max," Edward said. I think you were sent to me. You've got the same eyes as Charlie. It's almost like—" His voice trailed off, his thoughts drifting. Michael walked over and sat on the porch steps. "He really likes you, Dad," he said. Edward looked at his son, momentarily confused. "Who?" "Max," Michael clarified, nodding toward the dog. Edward's face softened. "Oh yes, he's a good boy, a real good boy." That afternoon, Michael decided to take Max to the vet. He hadn't had a chance to check the dog's health since he arrived, and after everything Max had been through, he wanted to make sure he was okay. "Stay here, Dad," Michael said as he grabbed his keys. "I'm taking Max to the vet. We'll be back soon." Edward frowned, his brow furrowing. "The vet? Why? Is he sick?" "No, Dad," Michael said gently. "It's just a checkup. He'll be fine." Edward nodded reluctantly. "All right, but take good care of him." "I will," Michael promised. At the vet's office, Max sat patiently in the waiting room, his tail thumping against the floor. The staff couldn't help but comment on his calm demeanor. "He's a handsome boy," the veterinarian said as she examined Max. "Strong and healthy overall, but it looks like he's been through a lot." Michael nodded. "He was a stray. I think he's been on the streets for a while." The vet pointed to a faint scar along Max's side. "This looks like an old injury, and he's got some wear on his teeth, probably from scavenging, but his temperament is remarkable, especially for a dog with his background." Michael smiled, scratching Max behind the ears. "Yeah, he's something special." When they returned home, Edward was waiting on the porch, his face lighting up as soon as he saw Max. "There you are," Edward exclaimed, opening his arms as Max bounded up the steps. "Did they treat you well, boy?" Michael chuckled. "He's fine, Dad. Healthy as can be." Edward knelt down, wrapping his arms around Max's neck. "Good. I told you, didn't I? You're a strong one." Over the next few days, the bond between Edward and Max grew even stronger. The dog seemed to sense when Edward was feeling confused or agitated, often nudging him gently. or resting his head on Edward's lap to calm him down. One evening, as Michael worked on his laptop in the living room, he overheard his father talking to Max in the next room. "You know," Edward was saying, "I don't remember much these days. Faces, names, they come and go. But you're always here. You make it easier. Somehow, you make it easier." Michael paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard. His father's words hit him like a wave, a reminder of how much Edward had lost and how much Max had given back to him. But not everything was easy. One afternoon, Edward forgot Michael's earlier warnings and opened the front gate to let Max roam freely. "Go on, boy," Edward said, waving him off. "Stretch your legs. Don't go too far now." When Michael returned from work and found the gate wide open, his heart sank. "Dad!" he called, rushing inside. "Where's Max?" Edward looked up from his chair, confused. "Max? He's around here somewhere." Michael bolted back outside, panic coursing through him. He called Max's name, searching the neighborhood, until finally he spotted the dog a block away, sniffing at a lamppost. "Max!" Michael shouted, relief flooding his voice. Max turned, his tail wagging as he trotted back toward Michael. When they returned home, Michael tried to stay calm, but his frustration bubbled over. "Dad, you can't just let him out like that," Michael said, his tone sharper than he intended. "What if something happened to him? What if he didn't come back?" Edward's face fell and he looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to. I just thought he needed some air." Michael sighed, guilt tugging at him. "I know, Dad. I'm sorry too. I don't want to lose him. Not after everything." Edward nodded, his eyes misty. "Me neither, son, me neither." That night, as Edward sat in his chair with Max at his feet, Michael watched them from across the room. The bond between them was undeniable, and Michael realized that Max wasn't just a dog, they were family. The evening began quietly, much like any other. Edward sat in his armchair, gently stroking Max's fur, while Michael worked on his laptop at the dining table. The hum of the heater and the soft rustle of papers filled the room, creating a sense of calm that had become rare in their home. "I think I'll turn in early tonight," Michael said, glancing at the clock. "You all right here, Dad?" Edward waved him off, a faint smile on his lips. "I've got Max to keep me company. You go get your rest." Michael hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the front door. He double-checked the locks before heading to his room. "Max," he said, patting the dog's head. "Watch over him." Max blinked up at him, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Hours later, the house was steeped in silence. The faint ticking of the clock on the mantel was the only sound as Edward dozed in his chair. Max lay nearby, his body stretched out but his ears alert to the slightest noise. Suddenly, Max's ears perked up. A faint sound, like the crunch of footsteps on gravel, filtered in from the driveway. His head snapped toward the door, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Edward stirred, blinking groggily. "What's that, boy?" he murmured, his voice slurred with sleep. Max rose to his feet, his body tense as he moved toward the door. Edward followed slowly, shuffling in his slippers. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly through the quiet house. A soft knock at the door made Edward pause. He squinted through the frosted glass but couldn't make out the figure on the other side. "Who is it?" he asked, his hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob. Max stepped in front of him, letting out a sharp bark that seemed to rattle the walls. Edward frowned, confused by the dog's behavior. "Max, it's all right," he said, patting the dog's head. "It's probably just a friend." But Max's growls grew louder, more insistent. Outside, two shadowy figures exchanged whispers. "Are you sure this is the place?" one of them asked, his voice low and urgent. "Yeah, I'm sure. The old guy's alone," the other replied. "Well, hurry up. That dog's making too much noise." Edward, oblivious to the danger, unlocked the door and cracked it open. "Hello?" he said, peering out into the darkness. The moment the door opened, one of the men stepped forward, shoving it wider. "Sorry to bother you, sir," he said with a strained smile. "Our car broke down nearby and we were wondering if we could use your phone." Edward hesitated, his brow furrowing. Michael usually handles things like this. The second man pushed his way inside, his movements quick and deliberate. "It'll just take a second, old man," he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. Before Edward could respond, Max surged forward, placing himself between Edward and the intruders. His growls turned into a ferocious bark, his body stiff and ready to attack. "Whoa!" one of the men exclaimed, stepping back. "Control your dog." Edward looked at Max, confused. "What's gotten into you, boy?" The intruders exchanged nervous glances. "We don't have time for this," one of them hissed, pulling a crowbar from under his jacket. Max's bark escalated into a snarl, his teeth bared as he lunged toward the man with the crowbar. The intruder swung the tool, but Max was too quick, dodging the blow and snapping at his arm. The man yelped, stumbling back as Max's teeth grazed his sleeve. "Let's get out of here," the other man shouted, panic seeping into his voice. "No way," his partner growled, gripping the crowbar tighter. The commotion woke Michael, who bolted out of bed, his heart pounding. He grabbed a baseball bat from his closet and rushed toward the living room, where he found the intruders cornered by Max. "Dad!" Michael shouted, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. Edward turned to him, his expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Michael, they said they needed help." Michael tightened his grip on the bat. "Get away from my father," he growled, stepping between Edward and the intruders. Max, emboldened by Michael's presence, lunged again, this time snapping at the second man's leg. The intruder stumbled, cursing as he backed toward the door. "This isn't worth it," he yelled, dragging his partner toward the exit. Max chased them out, his barks echoing into the night as they disappeared into the darkness. Michael rushed to Edward's side, his hands shaking as he checked him for injuries. "Are you okay, Dad? Did they hurt you?" Edward shook his head slowly, his eyes wide. I don't understand. They said they needed help." Michael pulled him into a tight embrace, his chest heaving with relief. "It's okay, Dad. They're gone now, thanks to Max." Max padded over, his tail wagging hesitantly as he nudged Edward's hand. Edward looked down at the dog, his confusion melting into a soft smile. "You saved me, didn't you?" Edward murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Good boy, Max. You're my guardian angel." The police arrived shortly after, alerted by a neighbor who had heard the commotion. As the officers took statements and examined the broken doorframe, Michael couldn't stop glancing at Max. The dog sat calmly by Edward's side, his body relaxed but his eyes sharp, as if ready to protect his family again if needed. One of the officers approached Michael, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's one hell of a dog you've got there," he said. Michael smiled faintly, his hand resting on Max's head. "Yeah," he said softly, "he is." That night, as the house finally quieted, Michael sat on the couch with Max curled up at his feet. Edward had gone to bed, still murmuring about how Max had saved him. Michael leaned down, resting his forehead against Max's. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Max licked Michael's hand, his tail wagging ever so slightly. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt a sense of peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they could face them together. The house felt different the morning after the break-in. Though the damage to the front door had been quickly patched, an invisible sense of security now lingered, one that came not from locks or alarms, but from Max's unwavering presence. Edward sat at the kitchen table with his usual cup of tea, staring out the window at the frost-covered lawn. Max was sprawled under the table, his chin resting on Edward's slippers, his breathing steady and comforting. "You've got a good heart, Max," Edward said, his voice soft. "Not many would stick around for an old man like me." Michael walked in, carrying a bag of dog treats and a new leash. He set them on the counter and glanced at Max, who perked up at the crinkling sound of the bag. "I thought he deserved something special after last night," Michael said, pouring coffee into a mug. "He earned it," Edward chuckled, patting Max on the head. "He's earned a medal, if you ask me." Over the following days, Max became even more integral to their routine. He followed Edward everywhere, from the living room to the garden, always a step behind, as if keeping watch. Michael noticed a shift in his father. Edward, who often spent hours lost in confusion or staring blankly at the walls, now seemed more grounded. He laughed more, told stories more, and even had fewer episodes of agitation. One afternoon, Michael walked into the living room to find Edward on the floor with Max, holding a tennis ball in his hand. "Come on, boy," Edward said, his tone playful. "You've got to earn this one." Max wagged his tail excitedly, barking once before lunging forward to grab the ball. Edward laughed, the sound filling the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Michael stood in the doorway watching the scene with a lump in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his father like this, so alive. That evening, as Edward dozed in his armchair, Michael sat on the couch with Max by his side. He reached down to stroke the dog's fur, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't voiced aloud. "Thank you," Michael whispered, his fingers brushing over Max's ears. "You've done more for him in a few weeks than I have in years." Max looked up at him with soft, understanding eyes, as if acknowledging the weight of Michael's words. The bond between Max and Edward grew stronger each day, but it also began to change Michael's perspective on his relationship with his father. One night, after Edward had gone to bed, Michael stayed up late, scrolling through old photos on his laptop. Pictures of his childhood flashed across the screen. Camping trips, birthdays, family vacations. His father had always been there, stern but present, guiding him through every milestone. "I didn't appreciate you enough," Michael murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. He closed the laptop and glanced at Max, who was curled up at his feet. "We've both been given a second chance," he said softly, scratching Max behind the ears. The next morning, Michael decided to take Max on a proper outing. He'd been hesitant to leave the dog alone with Edward after the break-in, but now he felt confident they could handle it. "Dad," Michael said as they ate breakfast, "I'm going to take Max for a walk at the park. You'll be okay here for a bit, right?" Edward nodded, though his eyes lingered on Max with a hint of reluctance. "Don't keep him too long," he said. "He's got a job to do here." Michael smiled. "We'll be back soon." At the park, Michael let Max off the leash, watching as the dog bounded across the grass, sniffing at every tree and bush. Other dog owners stopped to admire him, commenting on his well-behaved demeanor. "He's a rescue," Michael explained to one woman, a Labrador owner. "Showed up at our house one day and never left." "He's a beautiful boy," she said, patting Max's head. Michael nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "He's more than that, he's family." When they returned home, Edward was waiting on the porch, his face lighting up the moment he saw Max. "There you are," Edward said, holding out his arms as Max ran up the steps. "Did you enjoy your adventure, boy?" Max wagged his tail furiously, leaning into Edward's touch. Michael watched them, his heart full. He had been so consumed by his own worries, about work, about his father's condition, that he hadn't realized how much Max had transformed their lives. "Maybe we both needed him," Michael said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Edward looked up, his hand still resting on Max's head. "He's a gift," he said simply. "Someone up there must have known we needed him." That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Michael found himself reflecting on the past few weeks. The break-in, though terrifying, had been a turning point. Max wasn't just a protector, he was a healer, bridging the gap between father and son in ways neither of them could have imagined. Before heading to bed, Michael knelt down beside Max, who was curled up on his blanket near the couch. "Good night, buddy," he said, his voice soft. "Thanks for sticking with us." Max opened one eye, his tail thumping against the floor. Michael smiled, giving the dog one last pat before heading to his room. In the dim light of the living room, Max shifted closer to Edward's chair, his head resting on the man's slipper. Even in sleep, his watchful presence was a reminder that, for this little family, hope had come in the form of a loyal stray with a heart big enough to carry them all. The night was still, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan of the old house feel amplified. Edward was asleep in his armchair, his head tilted back, a blanket draped over his lap. Max lay nearby, his ears twitching as he dozed lightly. Despite the calm, there was an unease in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Michael, exhausted from a long day, had gone to bed early, trusting Max to keep watch over Edward as he always did. The house was locked up tight, and Michael felt a rare sense of security knowing Max was there. A faint scraping sound broke the silence, pulling Max from his slumber. His head shot up, ears perked as he listened intently. Another sound, this time the unmistakable creak of the side gate swinging open. Max stood, his body tense, and let out a low growl that rumbled through the quiet room. Edward stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "What's the matter, boy?" he mumbled, his voice groggy. Max didn't take his eyes off the window, his growl growing louder. Outside, a shadow moved along the side of the house. It was one of the intruders from the previous break-in, emboldened by their escape and determined to finish what they had started. This time, he was alone, armed with a crowbar and a flashlight. The man moved toward the back door, testing the handle. When it didn't budge, he crouched down to work on the lock. Inside, Max's growl turned into a bark, sharp and commanding. Edward sat up, confused but alert. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice shaky. The intruder froze for a moment, then muttered under his breath, "Shut that dog up." He jimmied the lock harder, ignoring Max's warning barks. The commotion woke Michael, who bolted out of bed, his heart pounding. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and rushed toward the living room, where he found Edward sitting upright, staring toward the back door. "Dad, stay here," Michael said firmly, his voice low. "What's going on?" Edward asked, his confusion evident. "Just stay with Max," Michael repeated, but Max wasn't staying put. He had already moved toward the back door, his body rigid, his growls deep and menacing. Michael followed the dog, gripping the bat tightly. As he reached the kitchen, he saw the shadow of the intruder through the curtains. "Get out of here," Michael shouted, his voice echoing through the house. The man flinched but didn't retreat. "I'm not leaving empty-handed," he muttered, swinging the crowbar against the doorframe. That was all Max needed to hear. With a burst of energy, the dog lunged at the door, barking ferociously. The sound was deafening, and it sent the intruder stumbling backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Damn dog," the man cursed, turning to run. Max didn't let up. He darted out through the side door that Michael had opened, chasing the man into the yard. Michael ran after them, his heart racing as he watched Max corner the intruder near the fence. The man swung the crowbar wildly, but Max was too fast, dodging each attempt and barking relentlessly. "Call off your dog," the man shouted, his voice panicked. Michael stood a few feet away, the bat still in his hand. "You're lucky he hasn't done worse," he said coldly. "You shouldn't have come back." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The intruder's face twisted in fear as he realized he was out of options. Max held his ground, his teeth bared, until the flashing blue and red lights illuminated the yard. The police arrived quickly, handcuffing the intruder and thanking Michael for his quick thinking. "You've got one brave dog there," one of the officers said, nodding toward Max, who was now standing calmly by Michael's side, his tail wagging faintly. "He's more than brave," Michael replied, his voice filled with pride. "He's a hero." Back inside, Edward was waiting anxiously in the living room. When Michael and Max returned, Edward's face broke into a relieved smile. "There's my boy," he said, opening his arms for Max. Max trotted over, leaning into Edward's touch as the old man ruffled his fur. "Did you save us again, huh?" Edward asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a good boy, Max. The best boy." Michael watched the interaction, his chest tightening with gratitude. For the second time, Max had protected their family, proving that his loyalty and courage knew no bounds. That night, as the house finally quieted, Michael sat with Max on the couch, stroking the dog's fur. Edward had gone to bed, mumbling about how they should give Max a medal. "You've done more for this family than I ever could have imagined," Michael said softly, his voice breaking. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Max looked up at him, his eyes warm and steady, as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere." The days following the second break-in brought a sense of clarity to Michael. He sat at the kitchen table one morning, watching Edward and Max through the window. The two were in the front yard, Max sitting alertly at Edward's feet as the older man talked to him. Edward waved a hand in the air, recounting a story from years ago, and Max tilted his head as if hanging on to every word. Michael smiled faintly, his coffee cooling in his hands. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, a protector, and the glue that held their little family together. That afternoon, Michael made the decision to adopt Max officially. He called the local shelter to start the process, explaining how the dog had come into their lives. "He's already family," Michael told the woman on the phone. "We just need to make it official." The shelter worker chuckled. "It sounds like he chose you," she said warmly. "We'll handle the paperwork on our end. Just bring him in for a quick checkup and he'll be all yours." Later that evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, Michael cleared his throat to get Edward's attention. "Dad," he said, looking from Edward to Max, "I've decided to adopt Max. He's staying with us for good." Edward blinked, his expression softening into a smile. "Good," he said simply, leaning down to scratch behind Max's ears. "He belongs here." Michael looked at the dog, who had settled at Edward's feet, his tail wagging lazily. "Yeah," Michael murmured, "he does." The next few weeks felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from their home. With Max officially part of the family, Michael noticed a profound change in Edward. He seemed more grounded, more present, as if Max's steady companionship gave him an anchor in the haze of his Alzheimer's. Edward began to look forward to their daily routines. Morning coffee with Max by his side, walks around the block where Max would gently nudge him back on track if he wandered, and quiet evenings where the two would sit together, a silent understanding passing between them. "You've brought him back to me," Michael said to Max one night, as the dog lay curled up on the couch. "Thank you for that." One Saturday, Michael took Max to the shelter for his adoption checkup. The staff greeted them warmly, marveling at Max's calm demeanor and healthy appearance. "He's a completely different dog from when we first found him," one of the workers said, running her hand along Max's back. Michael nodded. "He's done more for us than I could ever repay. He's not just a pet, he's family." As they left the shelter with the adoption papers in hand, Michael felt a sense of pride and relief. Max wasn't going anywhere. Back home, Edward was waiting on the porch, his face lighting up as soon as he saw Michael's car pull into the driveway. "There's my boy," Edward said, as Max hopped out of the car and bounded up the steps. Michael handed Edward the adoption papers, smiling as his father squinted at them. "What's this?" Edward asked. "It's official," Michael said. "Max is ours." Edward looked down at the dog, his eyes misty. "Well, of course he is," he said with a chuckle. "We've always been his." The months passed, and Max continued to transform their lives. Edward's condition, though progressive, seemed easier to manage with Max by his side. The dog's presence brought a sense of peace to their home, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, love and loyalty could endure. Michael began to realize how much he had changed too. He no longer saw his role as Edward's caretaker as a burden. Instead, it felt like a privilege, a chance to honor the man who had raised him. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sun set, Edward turned to Michael with a rare moment of lucidity. "You've done a good job, son," he said softly. "Your mum would be proud." Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Thanks, Dad." Edward reached down to pat Max's head. "And this one," he added, his voice warm. "He's the best thing that's happened to us." Michael nodded, watching as Max leaned into Edward's touch. "Yeah," he said quietly, "he really is." The story ends with the family sitting together under the fading light of the evening, a portrait of resilience and love. Max lies at Edward's feet, his eyes half closed but his body alert, ever the protector. As the sun dips below the horizon, Michael leans back in his chair, feeling a rare sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, everything feels right.